All right. Nkrumah Ture once again back. We're going to be finishing up chapter three, where President Nkrumah um, describes through accounts he was told as he sat in Conakry what happened, the elements that were involved, the people that were harmed, as you uh, now know from the last upload, and really um, because certain things had to be compromised as the Convention People's Party got into power in 1951, really, when he was appointed leader of government business and then later prime minister. What has to be understood in these developing countries, and in the case of Ghana, you have a colonial regime that uh, seemingly leaves, which they really never do, but physically leaves uh, the presence of, in this case, Africans. Africans come to power. Really, at that point, was more of a nominal independence because these foreign British people were still involved. Um, there's a legacy of colonialism there and training from foreigners to your own people. And when the CPP really became the in charge in terms of the de facto independence in 1957, you have to understand that most of the skills that were needed to administer the country through the civil service, the administration, and the party was within those, by and large, of the opposition, who at one point thought at the eve of independence, or before it was established that Nkrumah and Convention People's Party would be the ones to take the reins of power. They thought that they would be the ones to follow the Brits. You see, in fact, they had gotten to the point where they had really accepted that type of rule in their own land, and it's really paradoxical because who really in the right mind really would really willingly accept a foreigner treating you as a inferior in your own land? But obviously that's another story, and and actually it took a long time for that to happen, but it did happen. So a lot of compromises coming into 1957 had to be made. He had to ingratiate some people who normally were opposed to his policies and how the Convention People's Party was not only constructed, but how it operated throughout the country. Also, you had problems within groups up in the upper northern region, the Volta region, within the Ashanti and other groups as well, because there were privileges within the colonial regime, believe it or not, and this was really a tactic of divide and conquer that they once at that up until that particular point had enjoyed that they just were not going to enjoy really under the Convention People's Party. Not the fact that they would be totally disenfranchised, no, but the fact of the matter was the CPP was built for the masses of the people, the workers. You have to understand that. What they felt, those Africans who had privileges within the colonial system at that point, they thought that they can continue that on their own. You understand? No such thing was going to happen. So obviously, you can see here that the contention between the Convention People's Party, socialist development on one hand, and those in the bourgeois class and the professional class who were allowed at one point, at one point they were allowed to expand themselves professionally, even were invited back into Britain, those people who want to go to college. And this was really all to make sure that, in this case, if we're talking about Britain here, that they can curry favor in any event that the regime would change, that they would still have some sort of, control and influence. The French did the same thing. The Belgians did the same thing. You can see the same pattern all over Africa as well. So, and they kept these particular institutions in place. So Nkrumah had to compromise some things. He had to keep for a time being until he can get Africans trained and he can reorganize it and re-Africanize everything. You're talking about people coming from really a colonial situation that had really very, very little on a mass scale, a very, very a little amount of, if any, development to coming into their own, having to taking the reins of power and have to do it themselves. You understand? So you had these problems in Africa. You had where industrialization started, as I read earlier. You had the rise of organized crime, and that's really true of all societies, wherever the mode of production and economic system is. If there's industrialization involved, you're going to have a higher rate of crime. They had to deal with that. So you can see there was a lot of things that were calculated risk on one hand and compromises on the other. So this is what he was talking about. So with that, we'll go ahead and continue. We're not going to be here that long. We're just going to finish off chapter 3, and then we'll get into chapter 4 next time. But so this is basically chapter 3 continue, and we'll go to the end on this. So, Nkrumah continues. And this is page 43. Certainly, the NLC made the greatest efforts to secure Bing's arrest, demanding him from the Australian High Commission where he had taken refuge. When he was in their custody, he was continually interrogated as to what he knew about the diamond matter and was kept in prison for a month. His secretary, an English lady, who had served continuously in Ghana from colonial days, was placed under house arrest and not allowed to leave until she had found and handed over personally to Deku all the papers in Bing's wrecked office which dealt with diamond smuggling. Bing's subsequent deportation was not an act of grace by the regime, but an attempt to hush up the reason for his arrest. It was Harley and his close associates who subverted the army and persuaded certain officers to carry out the military side of the operation. Arifa, in the Apologia which appeared in his name in November 1966, boasts that he thought of a military coup as far back as 1961. Incidentally, I was amused to see that he used the final sentences from my autobiography as an opening to the postscript of his book, though he makes no acknowledgement, and the passage appears without quotation marks. That's a little plagiarism, though. We all see that. Kotoka had also claimed credit for the coup. In fact, immediately after the NLC was proclaimed, there was a positive rush to claim entire credit for the betrayal of Ghana. In London, Daniel Amelia, calling himself the leader of the African Democratic Party, wherever that may be, appeared on BBC TV in a new suit and said that he had masterminded the coup. He boasted that he had been trained by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, and the Americans did not deny this. Amelia was lured back into Accra, publicly exposed as a fraud by the jealous NLC, and promptly thrown into prison, and no one seems to know what has become of him. Kofi Busia, a former opposition leader, and this man later became another puppet they installed as president, but at this point, as a former opposition leader, was also interviewed by the BBC in London. Though he was too much of a politician to say openly that he plotted the overthrow of the constitutional government of Ghana, but obviously tried to give the impression that he had played an important part in planning the military and police action. Doubtless, there were traitorous and disloyal thoughts in the minds of all those who carried out and supported the action of 24th February 1966. But I am convinced that it was Hartley and his close associates, inspired and aided by disgruntled former opposition party members and neo-colonialists, who were the real initiators. They alone possessed the necessary vital information needed for its success. Much of this information they obtained for Eric Otu, a civil servant whom I appointed Chief Executive Officer in charge of security, and whom I left behind in Ghana in a position of great responsibility and trust when I departed for Hanoi. Otoo betrayed the trust put in him and revealed everything to the traitors. Without his cooperation, they might not have succeeded. The moral wickedness of it astounds me. How a man trusted with such responsibility can assist a clique of former let me try that again. How a man trusted with such responsibility could assist a clique of traitors defies understanding. For years, traitors among the old colonial office. Let me try that again. My apologies. For years, traitors among the old colonial police had plotted to overthrow my government. Their original idea was to kill, but having failed in several assassination attempts, and no doubt inspired by a neo-colonialist aided military coup in other parts of Africa, they then decided to look for support in the army. Police subversion of certain army officers was not difficult. Harley knew and trusted Kotoka. They belonged to the same tribe, Iwe, both of them born in the Volta region, and even attended the same school. They met on many occasions in Kumasi and elsewhere and plotted. Kotoka then began to approach other officers, notably Arifa and Asante. There has always been a close link between the Iwis and Asante reactionary elements, and Kotoka judged rightly that Arifa would be likely to respond favorably. So it went on, until a sufficient number of officers had been roped in. Here I must make the point that only a relatively small number of officers were actually subverted. Once the rebellion had begun, others often, I'm having being tongue-tied, forgive me. Let's try that again. Once the rebellion had begun, others offered no open resistance, for the majority were taken completely by surprise and were faced with a fait accompli. The fact that Hartley and others found it fairly easy to get support in the army may also be explained by what has been called the Sandhurst mentality, that's in quotations, of certain officers. These men, trained in various English military establishments, prided themselves on being more English than Ghanaian, and tended to frown on everything in our Ghanaian way of life which did not conform with British customs and traditions. They gradually became more British than the British, as they slavishly tried to imitate the traditional English army officer. Ankara is a typical example with his enthusiasm for the Turk Club, his love of ceremonial, and his sense of caste. Arifa has called Sandhurst one of the greatest institutions in the world. He looks with nostalgia on the days he spent there. Through its doors have passed famous generals, kings, and rulers. It is an institution that teaches that all men are equal, that the profession of men at arms is essential and a peaceful one. The confusion in his mind, as you can see, is obvious. Like many other army officers in the developing countries who have received part of their training in imperialist establishments, he had been brainwashed into showing more devotion to his counterparts in imperialist countries than to his own countrymen. He considered himself a gentleman, far superior to the peasants and workers in his own country. He admits that it was while he was in Britain that he first heard criticism of the Ghanaian government. He listened to people running down our efforts to achieve economic independence. He read in the British press that I was a dictator and that Ghana had stepped out of line in establishing a one-party state and in pursuing such revolutionary aims as the complete liberation and unity of the African continent. Instead of being proud to be a Ghanaian and in the vanguard of the African revolutionary struggle, he identified himself with the critics of his own government and people. Arifa's case history is similar to that of many more of our army officers in the independent states of Africa. While training in imperialist countries, they become imbued with ideas and traditions which makes them easy game for those plotting to overthrow progressive governments. I sometimes wonder what the imperialists teach in their military training centers in the way of loyalty, surely one of the basic qualities of a good soldier. The record of treason among those who have passed through their courses of training is prodigious. Arifa is a fair example. Approximately 1/6 of the Ghana Officer Corps were trained at Sandhurst, though for some years we had been sending an increasing number to train in the Soviet Union and in other socialist countries. It is significant that not one of the officers trained in the Soviet Union took part in the February uprising. Throughout the independent states of Africa, there are foreign military missions and training schemes which involve the indoctrination of our young armies with imperialist ideas and traditions. It is estimated that in 1964, nearly 3,000 French officers and men were seconded or contracted to the armed forces of the independent African states, while 1,500 Africans were training in France. Recently, the United States had greatly increased its military expenditure and activity in Africa. In 1964-65, U.S. aid to the Congo Kinshasa quadrupled that of Belgium. Liberia and Ethiopia are also receiving large-scale American military aid. Growing numbers of African officers are being sent for training in the USA and West Germany. Over the years, links have been forged between Army officers of different African states who have received training in the same or similar overseas military establishments. These links have been strengthened by organizations such as the Defense Commission of the Organization of African Unity, the Equatorial Defense Council of the Afro-Malagasy Defense Organization. One coup could therefore tend to spark off another. The arrogant, ambitious elite of imperialist trained officers among our professional armies have already caused much suffering and confusion in Africa. They have been the willing tools of neo-colonialists and of reactionary counter-revolutionary forces within their own countries. In a rash of army mutinies and coups between the end of 1962 and in March 1967, 15 heads of state have been removed and positions of others seriously endangered. The only way to ensure against the possibility of internal subversion carried out by the Army and inspired and aided by outside forces is eventually, when an all-African Union government has been established, to abolish professional armies altogether and to build instead a people's militia by arming the peasants and the urban workers, as in China and Cuba. Such an armed force could not be subverted and is the best guardian of the people's interest and welfare. We were moving toward the establishment of a people's militia in Ghana, and this is one of the reasons why there was support among certain army officers for a seizure of power. They feared competition from the militia and the Presidential Guard Regiment, thinking I was building up a private army. Kotoka admitted this when he visited New York to consult his masters some months after setting up of the NLC. Nkrumah, he said, was building up a militia. Who can tolerate that? Just give me a minute. We'll continue in a second here. Hold on. Okay, we're back. All right, let me continue here. I'm a little tangled here, so give me a little extra time here to get untangled here. I'm going to go over the record of military action that was initiated by the opposition which became puppet regimes and was backed by the Western governments. Hold on for a second. Now remember, this is 1968 that Nkrumah is giving these facts between the record of military action at this point. He chronicles between December 1962 through March 1967, but what indeed through the 60s we had anywhere between 27 to 30. But I'll just go over the ones he had here. It'll be the date, the actual nation where it occurred, and actually the outcome. Okay, the brief outcome. So this part won't be very long. Now, 17th December 1962 in Senegal, there was an attempt to overthrow President Leopold Senghor, but it failed. Okay. 13th January 1963 in Togo, President Olympio, Sylvanus Olympio, was assassinated. On the 12th to 15th of August 63 in Brazzaville, there was a forced resignation of that president, Yulu. And October 19th to 28th in 1963 in Dahomey, President Hubert Maga was deposed. And you'll see the close proximity in time all these coups d'etats happen. 3rd December in 63, Niamey. I don't know if that's I don't think that's any. I think that's renamed now, but at the time, that part, Niamey in Africa. Well, what happened was a military mutiny suppressed, but it was suppressed by President Hamani Diori, and it was more moving on, January 20th, 23rd, and 24th, 1964, in Tanzania and Uganda, military mutinies happened, but they were suppressed as well. 18th February 1964 in Gabon, President Leon Mbia was deposed. 18th June 1965 in Algeria, President Ben Bella was overthrown. 25th November of 65 in the Congo, presidential powers were assumed by Joseph Mobutu. He's the one that whose troops captured Patrice Lumumba and delivered him into Katanga to his enemies, his hated enemies, and was subsequently assassinated. 22nd December 65 in Dahomey, assumption of power by President Suglo, and the 1st January 65, Central Republic, forced resignation of President David Deco, December 4th, 65, Upper Volta, President Yamingo was opposed. 15th January 66 in Nigeria, Prime Minister Biwa and 2 regional premiers killed. And 24th, of course, February, Ghana, seizure of power by neo-colonial powers inspired by military and police officers. Then he talks about in the 29th, July 66, Nigeria, a gentleman named General Ironski was killed. And November 29th, 66 in Burundi, King Yeteri V was deposed. January 1367 in Togo, the resignation of President Grunski. And 24th March 67 Sierra Leone, there was a army seizure of power. But he goes on to say, to further emphasize that nearly all these military interventions were counter-revolutionary in character and have set the clock back on the states in which they occurred. It seemed for a time that though Africa might be going the same way as Latin America, but obviously the precise course of the military action in each territory differed, but most of them had certain factors in common which give the clue to their true nature and origin. In each case where there has been a counter-revolutionary armed action, there has been a link-up between foreign-trained army officers, local reactionary opposition elements, and imperialists and neo-colonialists. People must understand that because that's still the case. But let's go on. He continues. 10 of the 38 independent states of Africa now have military regimes established as a result of coups. These military so-called governments administer some 99 million people. The neo-colonialists smile. The peoples of Africa suffer, but the African Revolution triumphs. As I said in my sessional address to the National Assembly at Accra on 1st February 1966, it is not the duty of the army to rule or govern, because it has no political mandate, and its duty is not to seek a political mandate. The army only operates under the mandate of a civil government. If the national interest compels the armed forces to intervene, then immediately after the intervention, the army must hand over to the new civil government elected by the people and enjoying the people's mandate under a constitution accepted by them. If the army does not do this, then the position of the army becomes dubious and involves a betrayal of the people and the national interest. So he understood that clearly before he left, 23 days later. For some years, he says, imperialism has had its back to the wall in Africa. It has been forced with a growing liberation movement which it is powerless to stop, but which, if it allows it to go unchecked, will before long end the exploitation on which imperialism's very existence depends. It has therefore resorted to a coordinated strategy in an attempt to preserve, and if possible to extend, its grip on the economic life of our continent. An all-out offensive is being waged against the progressive, independent states, where the more subtle methods of economic pressure and political subversion have failed to achieve the desired result. There has been resort to violence in order to promote a change of regime and prepare the way for the establishment of a puppet government. I went over this in the videos on neocolonialism. Okay, so we understand clearly. You should, at this point, what he's talking about is I'm conveying it to you here. Let's move on. Fragmented in so many separate states, many of them weak and economically non-viable, coups d'etats have been relatively easy to arrange in Africa. All that has been needed was a small force of disciplined men to seize the key points of the capital city and to arrest the existing political leadership. In the planning and carrying out of these coups, there have been just sufficient numbers of dissatisfied and ambitious army officers and politicians willing to cooperate to make the whole operation possible. It has been one of the tasks of the CIA and other similar organizations to discover these political quislings and traitors in our midst, and to encourage them, by bribery and the promise of political power, to destroy the constitutional government of their countries. In Ghana, the embassies of the United States, Britain, and West Germany were all implicated in the plot to overthrow my government. It is alleged that the U.S. Ambassador Franklin Williams offered the traitors $13 million to carry out a coup d'etat. Arifa, Harley, and Kotoka were all to get a large share of this if they would assassinate me at the Accra airport as I prepared to leave for Hanoi. I understand that Arifa said, "I think I will fail," and declined that offer. So apparently did the others. It is particularly disgraceful that it should have been an Afro-American ambassador, which I didn't know at first before I read this book. The African-American ambassador who sold himself out to the imperialists and allowed himself to be used in this way. It was the same man who deliberately lied when he publicly described the coup as bloodless. However, his treachery provides a sharp reminder of the insidious ways in which the enemies of Africa can operate. And get this, he says, in the U.S., the quote-unquote Uncle Tom figure is well known. We have mercifully seen less of him in Africa, but we call him Coon today. So you can see even then, in 66, even in Africa. See, let me just divert for a minute here, because it's really related to what I'm reading to you. We don't have very long, by the way. There's a few more pages in this chapter, but see, our struggle is not isolated. It's not just in one spot in the world. You see, you may see it happening to people in your locale, but you can bet that our struggle is not an isolated one. It's a world wide struggle against a system that operates on a global basis. People need to understand that and start thinking in that sense in terms of how we actually defeat it and become independent. So very, very, not only necessary for me to say that, but very important to highlight here. And this is what these selfless leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and others in their time was talking about. And we have to listen to that. These people left us documentation, they left us their papers, they left us their philosophies, films, things of this nature, of their political positions that just need really the necessary updates in our day to build off that and to become a powerful and independent people. All right, so let's continue. The activities of the CIA no longer surprise us. We have experienced many examples of the work of this organization in recent years. Last May 1966, the subversive activities of the U.S. Embassy military attaché in Somalia, Colonel Romer, was exposed. He had been making approaches to Somali army officers and organized the illegal importation of arms into the country with the object of carrying out a coup d'etat. In July 1965, Taylor Ordell, an attaché with the U.S. Embassy, was expelled from Egypt after being caught red-handed receiving confidential documents from Mustafa Amin, an Egyptian CIA agent. In South Sudan, the so-called Azania Liberation Front was founded with CIA support and funds, your tax dollars. Its purpose was to detach South Sudan from the rest of the country and to proclaim the independent state of Azania, I believe, yeah, A-Z-A-N-A, Azania. In the Congo, Brazzaville, the CIA has been involved in various attempts to sabotage the progressive government of President Dibak. The record of the CIA activity in the Congo, Kinshasa, is equally disturbing and continuing. Between 1961 and 1964, CIA agents murdered